We've heard of disaster weddings, but have you ever attended a disaster funeral? What happened? My grandfather died. The funeral was a solemn affair, as these things usually are. My grandmother, naturally, was distraught. They married during the war, he'd been captured and sent to a POW camp. They then spent over 50 blissful years together. We were chatting about my grandfather with her laughing, crying, reminiscing when entirely out of the blue she said, "One thing I won't miss is sleeping next to him. He always rolled over and nearly pushed me out of bed." A few years later she died as well. It's hard to carry on when the life you knew for half a century has been ripped apart. As per her wishes, she was to be buried next to her husband. We dutifully trudged down to the cemetery, held a small ceremony, and escorted her body to the grave. The double headstone had already been half filled with my grandfather's details. Underneath the blank half, a 6-foot deep hole lay waiting. We slowly lowered my grandmother's coffin in. It didn't fit. There wasn't enough room in the grave for the bloody coffin. Despite being dug on the correct side of the grave, somehow my grandfather's coffin had conspired to shift under the earth and encroached on my grandmother's side. The mourning party excused ourselves from the graveside while adjustments were made. All of us giggling about how Granddad had rolled over in his sleep again. Well, it was preferable to thinking the gravediggers were too stupid to dig a correctly sized hole in the ground. That's the cutest story I've ever heard that required 2 people to die. My brother was working for a funeral home. He was handing out yarmulkes at the door of the event room, where a Jewish funeral was being held when there was a hell of a commotion inside, screaming, yelling, furniture falling over. The doors slam open and a bunch of guys drag the rabbi out into the parking lot and beat the shit out of him, while people run around screaming and freaking out, and my brother just stands there paralyzed with a stack of paper beanies clutched in his hands. Turns out it was the wrong body in the box. Aside from the usual concerns about where the hell dear departed Uncle Ira is, this also means that the rabbi didn't sit with the body like he was supposed to, which is a big deal to observant Jews. Cops were called, various people were hauled away, Uncle Ira was located, the funeral home and the rabbi were sued. No idea what happened to any of them because my brother quit a month later. My great-grandmother's funeral. When the coffin was in the ground, before the grave was filled, obviously, family members each threw a rose on top of the coffin. My obese step-grandmother lost her balance and fell into the grave. Very comical. Oh geez, I hope she was all right. How'd you get her out? My mum told me to leave because I was laughing too hard, so I didn't see it firsthand. Apparently the maintenance staff had to be called. I assumed they had to use a ladder or something, because there was no way she could pull herself out of that grave, let alone 4 other people trying to pull her up, which was happening when I left. Not really a disaster, but pretty funny nonetheless. My grandpa throughout his life attended many funerals. In every, no exaggeration, funeral procession, I think it's called, where everyone drives their cars in a line from the funeral home to the graveyard, that he drove in, he would get hit by another car. Usually it happened while crossing the intersection during a red light, since funeral processions can run them. Nevertheless, it always happened. It was always minor and nobody got hurt. Fast forward to his own funeral. He is in the hearse on his way to be buried and the freaking hearse gets hit. No joke. This sounds like he pissed off the wrong witch or whatever and they put a really shitty curse on him. And in every funeral procession you're in, may your car get hit by another one. Not me, but I used to work for a funeral director because I was considering going to mortuary school. He told me about a funeral where a guy busted into the cathedral and threatened the entire funeral party with a handgun. He'd robbed the gas station down the street and the cops were after him, so naturally he thought he'd hide in a funeral. Anyway, turns out the cops were closer on his tail than he imagined, because they rolled in right after him. They ended up chasing him to the parish hall and tazzed his ass in front of the whole funeral congregation. Not long after I married into a very large family, there was a funeral for a distant relative. We're at the grave, just finishing the ceremony, body has been lowered, and we hear sirens and yelling. A guy comes running towards the group, gun in one hand, plastic bag in another, cash from a robbery. Trying to escape, and he runs straight into a cop's funeral. I'm talking, most of the local police departments have people at this event. Place is crawling with cops and other first responders in their dress uniforms. It took about 5 seconds to put this guy on the ground. Best part was the elderly widow who never moved out of her seat, watching them drag this guy away, shakes her head and mutters, "Dumbass. Love and miss you, Nana." I went to the funeral of a good friend a month ago. In his 70 years he'd moved a long way from the aristocratic competitive English family he was born into. Partly due to a bout of mental illness, partly due to his gentle, uncompetitive personality, he'd ended up working with homeless people in Toronto rather than pursuing a high-paying career. During the whole service, which was run by his 2 brothers, they insulted him at every turn, still looking down on him for not being as rich and successful as they were. I eventually stepped in and asked to speak, just so someone would say positive things about him. We thought we were gonna lose my grandfather at my grandmother's memorial service. Too much standing in hot weather, and he collapsed and lost consciousness. My ER nurse aunt was on the scene, though. Happy to say that was 8 years ago, and he's still alive and reasonably well. I'm a bagpiper for hire. I play a lot of funerals since I guess that's just when people want to hear me play. Not that I'm complaining, it's hot and sweaty, but it's a reasonable side job. Anyway, I lived in North Idaho at the time, so think hick country. The dad had died, committed suicide. Very tragic. I didn't want to press questions. But part way through the service, I hear voices raising, like shouting and swearing in the back of the group of people. Well, I usually stand a ways away from the actual burial for respect reasons, but I had to find out what was up. Lucky for my curiosity, I didn't have to get any closer because angry words turned into angrier fists. Turns out the brother and son of the man we fighting over who would get the apparently rare gun the man had killed himself with, they didn't even have the gun. They were fighting over who would get a gun that hadn't even been returned to the family. My Nana was one of 9 siblings. She was originally from England and that's where her siblings lived, but she lived in Australia. When she passed, none of her siblings were healthy enough to make the near day-long flight down under, so they each organized for flowers to be sent to the funeral service. Except that they all got sent to the wrong funeral home, and my Nana's funeral was very bare. Sad considering that her pride and joy was gardening. A similar thing almost happened with my grandma's funeral. I won't say she died unexpectedly, she was 92, after all, but she died very suddenly. She didn't go in for much pomp, so all she wanted was a simple funeral with a minister, family, and some flowers. I suppose she would have cared less about the flowers, but we wanted at least a few. Well, because of scheduling at the funeral home, we had to have the service on U.S. Memorial Day and the local flower stores were completely tapped out. So the first half of her funeral was quite Spartan, which we didn't mind all that much as she was a somewhat severe woman. But halfway through, the florists came through and all at once. It was quite a sight, going from a room WTH almost no decoration to a room with all the flowers. Grandma probably would have hated the interruption of a good, sober service, but we were pretty happy over the affair. This was an almost disaster. I was at my grandfather's funeral, and we were at the point when he was being lowered into the ground. My cousin's child, 3 to 4, was running around being an idiot when he ran straight for the giant rectangular hole. He slipped, but his dad grabbed his shirt just in time. I wouldn't call it a disaster per se, but my mom's burial was a bit of a train wreck. Basically, her side of the family is a tribe of emotionally unstable, rude, and selfish individuals who lie and cheat their way through life. My mom was no exception, but she was my mom, you know? Anyway, when she died, they refused to pay for any of her funeral. They were content with paying for a cremation and sharing her cremains. My dad said, "No fucking way," and we had a proper funeral burial. When it came time to lower her ashes into the plot, my 90-years-old grandma picked her ashes up off of the lowering deck and tried to run away with them, and began shaking her urn up and down while screaming, "This is at a fucking cemetery." It took 4 family members to get the urn out of her hands and put it back down so the service could continue. Thankfully, her cremains were in a sealed bag, because she definitely would have spilled. This was supposed to be a mournful moment, and my grandma turned it into something about her. It was the worst. They then came to the luncheon after the burial and acted like nothing happened. They still have never contributed a dime to her funeral costs, yet were enraged that I didn't invite them to my wedding. I don't speak to any of them anymore. Not a disaster, but at my step-grandfather's funeral I forgot to silence my phone and Dr. Roxo, the rock and roll clown, decided to announce my new text message by yelling, "Ideal cocaine!" during the eulogy. There was a steep flight of numerous granite steps and 3 large sections leading from the sidewalk to the main front doors of the church. During the funeral service, it started sleeting and icing up outside. Afterwards, as the pallbearers struggled to carry the coffin down to the hearse, a few lost their footing on the ice and the coffin crashed to the steps, careening down to the sidewalk below. Somehow the lid never opened, but the bottom of the coffin split partly open. The funeral directors had to use straps to secure it and hoist it in one piece into the hearse. Even though those attending were mortified by what they witnessed, some recalled at the reception thereafter that the deceased had a great sense of humor and probably would have found something appropriate to say to make light of it. Do you have a similar story? Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this one.